August 15th, 1944, 03:47 hours. Château de la Roche-Guyon, Wehrmacht Army Group. The Headquarters, Normandy. The amber glow of a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the oak-paneled war room, where General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge bent over reconnaissance photographs. The acrid smell of Turkish tobacco from his adjutant's cigarette mingling with the musty scent of ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of French nobility before becoming the nerve center of German resistance in the West. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness pressed against leaded windows, while inside, the measured tick of a Baroque clock counted down the seconds to what would become one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. Von Kluge straightened, his weathered fingers tracing the black and white images of American supply convoys snaking through the Norman countryside like mechanical centipedes, each truck identical to the next in that peculiar American way of mass production that German officers found both admirable and somehow crude. "Mein Gott," he muttered to Oberst Heinrich Zimmermann, his chief intelligence officer. "Look at this madness. They're moving their entire supply apparatus forward with their spearheads, as if logistics were some kind of American football play where everyone charges the goal line at once." The photographs showed something that defied every principle of European military doctrine. American forces were not establishing the careful, methodical supply depots that had characterized warfare since Napoleon, but instead were creating a rolling wave of materiel that moved with their advancing armor like a mechanical tide. Zimmermann adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted the latest intercepts from German radio listening posts scattered across occupied France, his voice carrying that particular mix of Prussian confidence and intellectual disdain that had served the Wehrmacht so well in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. "Herr Feldmarschall, our analysts calculate that the Americans are attempting to sustain 3 full armored divisions, Patton's entire Third Army, across a supply line that stretches over 400 kilometers from their Normandy beachheads," Zimmermann reported, spreading additional reconnaissance photos across the mahogany table like a dealer laying out cards for a high-stakes poker game. "According to every logistics manual ever written, from Clausewitz to our own general staff studies, such an operation should collapse within 72 hours from fuel starvation alone. The impossibility of the American claim was mathematical, undeniable, almost insulting in its brazen defiance of military science. 3 armored divisions required approximately 750,000 gallons of gasoline per day, along with 1,500 tons of ammunition, 300 tons of rations, and countless tons of spare parts, medical supplies, and the 1,000 other necessities that kept a modern mechanized army functioning in combat conditions, a logistical burden that should have ground their advance to a halt somewhere around St. Lo, leaving Patton's vaunted tanks as immobile monuments to American industrial hubris." Von Kluge's laugh carried the dry humor of a professional soldier who had spent 4 years watching enemies make fatal mistakes. "So the cowboys think they can simply drive their trucks fast enough to outrun mathematics itself," he said, tapping the photographs with his fountain pen, the gold nib catching the lamplight. Their own General Marshall admitted in intercepted communications that they're moving forward without establishing proper supply bases. It's as if they believe raw speed can substitute for sound military planning. Zimmermann nodded, consulting a leather-bound intelligence summary that bore the eagle and swastika seal of Wehrmacht High Command. "Our mathematicians have run the calculations 3 times, Herr Feldmarschall, and each time the result is identical. The American supply system should suffer catastrophic breakdown no later than August 20th, leaving their Third Army stranded east of the Seine with empty fuel tanks and no ammunition for their artillery." The German officer's confidence reflected not arrogance but the accumulated wisdom of European military tradition, where logistics had been refined over centuries of continental warfare into an exact science of tonnage per mile, supply depot spacing, and the immutable mathematics of distance versus carrying capacity. But even as von Kluge and his staff dismissed American logistics as the amateur fumbling of a nation that had never fought a real war on its own soil, something unprecedented was already unfolding along the highways of liberated France, something that would shatter German assumptions about the very nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Along Route Nationale 13, stretching from the Norman coast to the outskirts of Paris like a mechanical river flowing eastward, an endless procession of identical trucks moved day and night, in a display of logistical coordination that combined American mass production with the peculiar genius of a people who had spent decades perfecting the science of moving goods across vast distances. The trucks themselves were nothing remarkable by German standards. Simple, utilitarian vehicles lacking the sophisticated engineering that characterized German military equipment. But there were so many of them that quantity had achieved a quality all its own. Each 2.5-ton GMC truck carrying precisely the same load, painted the same olive drab, driven by men trained in identical procedures until the entire system functioned with the mechanical precision of an assembly line extending across hundreds of miles of French countryside. German observers, trained to recognize military vehicles by their distinctive silhouettes and technical specifications, found themselves confronting a phenomenon that transcended traditional military categories. This was not transportation in the European sense of carefully planned movements, coordinated by staff officers with decades of academic training, but rather a manifestation of American industrial culture, where problems were solved not through elegant theory, but through the brute application of overwhelming resources organized according to principles learned in Detroit factories and Chicago stockyards. What the German High Command could not have anticipated, sitting in their chateau war room surrounded by centuries of European military tradition, was that their intelligence reports were documenting not failure, but the birth of a logistical revolution that would rewrite the fundamental principles of modern warfare through the simple expedient of American industrial excess applied to military problems with a thoroughness that bordered on the absurd. Lieutenant Colonel James Crawford of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, writing in his classified after-action report dated September 3, 1944, would later describe the Red Ball Express as less a military operation than a civilian trucking company transplanted wholesale into a war zone, complete with the relentless efficiency that American business had perfected during 2 decades of economic competition. The documentation of this impossible system came from sources so diverse and numerous that even German intelligence officers, trained in the art of skeptical analysis, found themselves confronting an overwhelming body of evidence that defied every assumption about military logistics they had absorbed during their professional careers. Captain Heinrich Weber of the 116th Panzer Division, captured near Falaise on August 19, 1944, provided testimony during his interrogation that would later appear in Allied intelligence summaries marked Most Secret. For 3 days, we watched American trucks pass our hiding positions in the Forêt de Reynaud, not military convoys in the proper sense, but an endless procession of identical vehicles moving with the mechanical precision of a factory assembly line, each truck following the previous one at exactly the same interval, each driver maintaining exactly the same speed. Weber's account was corroborated by Obergefreiter Karl Richter of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Infantry Division, whose diary, discovered in a bombed-out farmhouse near Weiher, contained entries that read more like industrial surveys than military observations. August 16th, the Americans have painted large red circles on their supply trucks, as if this were some kind of sporting event rather than a war. And their drivers show no concern for concealment or tactical dispersal, moving in broad daylight along roads that should be death traps for any sensible military force. Richter's bewilderment reflected the collision between European military doctrine, which emphasized concealment and tactical sophistication, and American logistics, which relied on overwhelming volume to absorb losses while maintaining operational tempo through sheer industrial momentum. French civilians, liberated from 4 years of German occupation, provided their own testimony through interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers and war correspondents hungry for human interest stories that would satisfy editors back home demanding heartwarming tales of liberation. Madame Simone Dubois, a schoolteacher from the village of Mortain, told Associated Press correspondent Hal Boyle in an interview published in American newspapers on August 23, 1944, "The German trucks came through our village like wolves, fast, silent, always watching for Allied aircraft, their soldiers nervous and thin from years of war. But the American trucks move like a river that never stops flowing, their drivers waving at children and throwing chocolate bars as if they were on holiday rather than fighting the Wehrmacht." The contrast that Madame Dubois observed reflected something deeper than mere cultural differences between German efficiency and American exuberance. It revealed the fundamental transformation of warfare from a contest between armies to a competition between entire industrial societies, where victory would be determined not by tactical brilliance or individual heroism, but by the capacity to sustain massive logistical operations across continental distances while maintaining the morale and mechanical reliability necessary for sustained offensive operations. American war correspondents, trained to find human drama in military operations, discovered instead a story about trucks and gasoline that somehow embodied the clash between the old world and the new more effectively than any heroic battlefield narrative. Ernie Pyle, the most celebrated American war correspondent of the European theater, wrote in his dispatch dated August 20th, 1944. I've been following armies for 3 years now, from North Africa to Sicily to the beaches of Normandy, and I've never seen anything like these Red Ball Express convoys. They stretch from horizon to horizon like some kind of mechanical migration. Thousands of trucks moving eastward with the inevitability of a geological process. Their drivers, mostly Negro soldiers from places like Mississippi and Alabama, who handle these massive vehicles with the casual expertise of men born to drive. Pyle's observation captured not only the scale of the operation, but also its social dimensions. As the USB and Army's segregated logistics units found themselves at the spear point of a revolution in military affairs that would ultimately transform both warfare and American society itself. The mathematical impossibility that German staff officers had calculated with such confidence was being systematically demolished not through superior strategy or tactical innovation, but through the application of American industrial principles to military problems on a scale that European military tradition had never contemplated. Each Red Ball Express truck carried 5 tons of supplies across distances that would have required elaborate depot systems, according to classical military theory. But the Americans had simply built enough trucks to make distance irrelevant, creating a supply system that functioned more like a conveyor belt than a traditional military logistics operation. The genius of the system lay not in its sophistication, but in its brutal simplicity. Instead of calculating the optimal placement of supply depots according to classical military science, American planners had simply manufactured enough trucks to carry everything forward in a single continuous movement, transforming logistics from a careful balance of resources and distances into a demonstration of industrial capacity applied with typically American disregard for theoretical limitations. The technical reality of what the Germans dismissed as American amateurism revealed itself in the pre-dawn darkness of August 21st, 1944, at the primary Red Ball Express depot near Bayeux, where Staff Sergeant William Big Bill Johnson of the 3348th Quartermaster Truck Company stood beside his GMC CCKW 353 2.5-ton truck, checking tire pressure with the methodical precision of a Detroit assembly line worker, while around him stretched an industrial landscape that had materialized in the Norman countryside like a vision of American manufacturing, transplanted wholesale into the European theater of operations. The depot itself defied every principle of military camouflage and dispersal, existing as a vast rectangle of organized chaos where hundreds of identical olive-drab trucks sat in perfect geometric rows, their canvas covers gleaming with morning dew, while teams of mechanics moved between them like priests conducting mechanical sacraments under portable floodlights powered by gasoline generators that rumbled with the deep bass note of American industrial confidence. Johnson's truck, designated Red Ball 1247 in white stenciled numerals, represented the standardization that German industry had never achieved despite decades of Prussian organizational genius. Every bolt, every wire, every mechanical component had been manufactured in Detroit according to specifications so precise that parts from one truck could be installed in any other truck in the entire Red Ball fleet, creating a logistics system where mechanical failure became merely an inconvenience rather than a catastrophic breakdown of the entire supply chain. The CCKW 353 itself embodied American industrial philosophy in steel and rubber, a 6-cylinder engine producing 104 horsepower, a 5-speed transmission, all-wheel drive capability, and a payload capacity of 5,000 pounds that could be maintained across distances that would have destroyed more sophisticated European vehicles through the simple expedient of robust construction and abundant spare parts. But the true genius of the Red Ball Express lay not in individual vehicles, but in the systematic application of assembly line principles to military logistics, transforming what European armies treated as a complex staff problem requiring years of academic training into a mechanical process that could be executed by truck drivers recruited from civilian transportation companies across the American Midwest, men who understood instinctively that moving freight was ultimately about maintaining schedule and mechanical reliability, rather than tactical sophistication or strategic brilliance. The system's operating procedures, contained in a mimeographed manual titled Red Ball Express Standard Operating Procedures, can classified restricted read more like instructions for running a civilian trucking company than a military logistics operation. Drivers would depart at precisely scheduled intervals, maintain exact speeds and following distances, refuel at designated stations without deviation from prescribed routes, and deliver their loads according to a timetable that brooked no exception for weather, enemy action, or mechanical difficulties. The mathematical foundation of the system revealed the industrial logic that German staff officers had failed to comprehend in their chateau war room. Instead of calculating optimal supply depot placement according to classical military theory, American planners had simply determined the total tonnage required by advancing armored divisions and then manufactured enough trucks to carry everything in a single continuous movement, creating what transportation engineers called rolling inventory, where supplies moved forward constantly rather than accumulating in vulnerable static depots. Each Red Ball convoy consisted of exactly 40 trucks moving at precisely 35 miles per hour with a following distance of exactly 60 yards, creating a mechanical procession that consumed gasoline, tires, and spare parts at predictable rates while delivering a constant stream of material to forward units with the reliability of a factory production line. The depot operations themselves demonstrated American industrial efficiency applied to military problems with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Incoming trucks were unloaded by teams using standardized procedures learned from civilian freight companies, their cargo sorted according to predetermined categories, then reloaded onto outbound vehicles according to delivery schedules calculated to ensure that frontline units received exactly the supplies they needed precisely when those supplies were required. All coordinated through a communication system that relied not on traditional military radio networks, but on commercial telephone equipment operated by civilian technicians, borrowed from AT&T and other major communications companies. The entire operation functioned with the mechanical precision of a General Motors assembly plant, complete with time and motion studies, efficiency reports, and production quotas that treated warfare as simply another industrial process requiring optimal resource allocation and systematic quality control. Staff Sergeant Johnson, climbing into his truck's cab as the eastern sky began to lighten with the pale gray of dawn, represented the human element that made this mechanical system possible. A former long-haul trucker from Kansas who had spent 10 years driving freight across the American Great Plains, learning to maintain schedule and cargo integrity across distances that dwarfed European transportation networks. Bringing to military logistics the casual competence of a man who understood that moving goods efficiently was ultimately about mechanical reliability, route planning, and the simple determination to keep driving regardless of weather, fatigue, or external obstacles. His truck, loaded with 5,000 pounds of artillery shells destined for Patton's advancing armor, would travel 387 miles through liberated France in the next 18 hours. Part of a convoy system that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to frontline units across a supply network that stretched from Normandy to the outskirts of Paris like a mechanical artery pumping the lifeblood of American industry directly into the heart of combat operations. It was the mathematics of abundance conquering the logic of scarcity. American industrial capacity overwhelming European military tradition through the simple expedient of building more trucks than any reasonable army should need. Then using those trucks to maintain offensive momentum at a tempo that left German defenders unable to establish coherent defensive positions or organize effective counterattacks against forces that seemed to possess unlimited supplies of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. The collision between German theory and American reality reached its crescendo on the morning of August 25, 1944, near the village of Melun, 40 kilometers southeast of Paris, where Oberst Friedrich von Seckendorff-Aberdar of the 9th Panzer Division had positioned his remaining 17 tanks in carefully prepared defensive positions along the Seine River, confident that Patton's Third Army would exhaust its fuel supplies before reaching this final barrier protecting the approaches to the French capital. Von Seckendorff-Aberdar, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had learned to calculate enemy logistics with the precision of an accountant tallying inventory, stood in the cupola of his Panzer IV watching the morning mist rise from the river while mentally reviewing the mathematical certainty that had sustained German resistance through 6 weeks of retreat. American armored spearheads advancing at this pace across such distances must inevitably outrun their supply lines, leaving their tanks immobilized and vulnerable to counterattack by forces that had conserved fuel and ammunition through methodical withdrawal to prepared positions. The German colonel's confidence reflected not wishful thinking, but sound military science supported by 4 years of combat experience against enemies who had consistently failed when their logistics collapsed under the strain of extended operations. A pattern that had repeated itself from the Russian steppes to the deserts of North Africa, wherever armies had attempted to sustain mechanized operations across distances that exceeded their logistical capabilities. Through his binoculars, von Seckendorf-Aberdar could see American reconnaissance units probing his positions with the cautious movements of soldiers operating at the extreme limit of their supply chain, their Sherman tanks advancing in short bounds that suggested fuel conservation rather than the aggressive tactics that had characterized their earlier operations. Confirming his assessment that Third Army's offensive momentum had finally reached its mathematical breaking point. But, even as the German colonel prepared to exploit what he assumed was American logistical exhaustion, the sound of diesel engines began to build from the west like distant thunder, growing steadily louder until the entire landscape seemed to vibrate with mechanical noise that defied every assumption about supply limitations and fuel scarcity that had governed German defensive planning. The first Red Ball Express convoy appeared through the morning haze as a line of identical olive-drab trucks stretching back toward the horizon, each vehicle maintaining perfect spacing and speed while carrying the gasoline, ammunition, and spare parts that would transform Patton's supposedly fuel-starved spearheads into an unstoppable mechanical juggernaut capable of sustained offensive operations regardless of distance or logistical theory. Von Seckendorf-Aberdar watched in growing disbelief as the American supply convoy deployed with the efficiency of a civilian freight operation, trucks positioning themselves at predetermined coordinates, while teams of soldiers unloaded fuel drums and ammunition pallets with the casual competence of warehouse workers rather than the desperate urgency that should have characterized units operating beyond their logistical limits. Within 30 minutes, what had appeared to be an exhausted American reconnaissance force transformed into a fully supplied armored spearhead as Sherman tanks refueled directly from Red Ball Express tankers, while crews loaded fresh ammunition and replacement parts with an abundance that mocked every German calculation about supply limitations and operational sustainability. The German defensive position, so carefully prepared according to classical military principles that assumed enemy forces would weaken as they advanced beyond their supply bases, disintegrated under an assault that combined tactical aggression with logistical abundance in proportions that European military doctrine had never contemplated. American tanks advanced not with the cautious movements of units conserving fuel but with the mechanical confidence of forces that possessed unlimited supplies, their crews firing high-explosive shells with the profligate abandon of soldiers who knew that more ammunition would arrive within hours, rather than the careful rationing that characterized German operations after 4 years of industrial attrition and supply shortages. The battle itself lasted less than 2 hours, not because of superior American tactics or technological advantage, but because German defenders found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed immune to the logistical constraints that governed all military operations in European experience. An army that could sustain high-intensity combat operations indefinitely through the simple expedient of maintaining supply lines that functioned with the reliability of civilian transportation networks rather than the fragile complexity of traditional military logistics. Von Seckendorf-Aberdar's final radio transmission, intercepted by Allied listening posts and later filed in U.S. Army intelligence archives, captured the bewilderment of professional soldiers confronting industrial warfare. Enemy forces appear to possess unlimited fuel and ammunition, maintaining offensive operations despite extended supply lines that should have collapsed according to all accepted military calculations. The image that would haunt German survivors of the Melun engagement was not the tactical defeat itself, but the casual abundance displayed by American forces immediately after the battle. As Red Ball Express trucks continued to arrive in endless procession, their drivers unloading supplies with the methodical efficiency of men following industrial schedules rather than responding to military emergencies. German prisoners, marched past Red Ball convoys during their journey to prisoner of war camps, witnessed gasoline being used not only to fuel tanks and trucks, but to power generators for field kitchens, portable showers, and communication equipment. A display of logistical excess that violated every assumption about resource conservation and supply management that had governed German military thinking since the economic mobilization of 1939. Staff Sergeant Johnson, refueling his truck after delivering another 5,000 pounds of artillery shells to the advancing armor, represented the human face of this logistical revolution. a Kansas truck driver who had never studied military science but understood instinctively that moving freight efficiently was ultimately about maintaining reliable schedules and mechanical systems, rather than conserving resources or calculating optimal supply depot placement. His casual confidence, shared by thousands of Red Ball Express drivers across the length of France, embodied the transformation of warfare from a contest between armies to a competition between entire industrial societies, where victory would be determined not by tactical brilliance or strategic genius, but by the capacity to maintain massive logistical operations with the reliability and abundance that characterized American civilian transportation networks. The mathematics of the impossible had become the reality of the inevitable. American industrial capacity, overwhelming German military tradition through the simple application of overwhelming resources organized according to principles learned not in staff colleges but in the freight yards and assembly plants of a nation that had spent decades perfecting the science of moving goods across continental distances. The scale of American logistical operations revealed itself in numbers that transcended military statistics to become a demonstration of industrial capacity, so vast that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between resources and warfare, transforming the Red Ball Express from a transportation system into a manifestation of American manufacturing power, projected across the Atlantic Ocean and deployed on European battlefields with a thoroughness that left German intelligence analysts struggling to comprehend data that seemed more appropriate to peacetime industrial surveys than military logistics reports. The avalanche of statistics began with the trucks themselves. 5 of the 958 vehicles operating continuously along designated routes stretching 700 miles from Normandy to the advancing front lines. Each truck averaging 54 trips per month while consuming 8,000 gallons of gasoline daily per vehicle, creating a mobile supply system that burned through 64,000 gallons of fuel monthly just to maintain its own operations before delivering a single gallon to frontline units. The human cost of maintaining this mechanical river of supplies required 23,000 drivers working in continuous rotation, with 16,000 vehicles in motion at any given moment, while the remaining trucks underwent maintenance, loading, or crew rest according to schedules that treated mechanical reliability as the foundation of military success, rather than an incidental consideration subordinate to tactical planning. Each Red Ball Express driver averaged 20 hours per day behind the wheel during peak operations, covering distances that would have exhausted European transportation networks while maintaining delivery schedules that depended not on individual heroism or tactical sophistication, but on systematic adherence to industrial procedures learned from civilian freight companies that had spent decades perfecting the science of moving goods across the vast distances of the American continent. The mathematical foundation of the operation revealed itself in tonnage figures that dwarfed every previous military logistics effort in recorded history. 12,500 tons of supplies delivered daily during August 1944, rising to 19,000 tons per day by September as additional truck companies arrived from the United States and operational procedures were refined through the methodical application of efficiency studies borrowed from civilian transportation industries. This daily tonnage included 2,500 gallons of gasoline, 1,200 tons of ammunition, 800 tons of rations, 400 tons of medical supplies, 300 tons of spare parts, and hundreds of additional tons of the miscellaneous equipment that modern mechanized warfare consumed with an appetite that grew larger rather than smaller as American forces advanced deeper into German-occupied territory. The industrial infrastructure supporting these operations stretched back across the Atlantic to manufacturing centers that had been converted from peacetime production to military supply with a speed and thoroughness that exemplified American industrial flexibility. General Motors' Detroit plants producing 650,000 trucks annually for military use while maintaining civilian automobile production some days. Firestone Tire Company manufacturing 2,000 truck tires monthly while developing synthetic rubber production to replace supplies cut off by Japanese conquest of Southeast Asian rubber plantations. And hundreds of smaller companies contributing components that were assembled into the vehicles, spare parts, and equipment that kept the Red Ball Express functioning despite mechanical breakdowns, enemy air attacks, and the normal attrition that destroyed military equipment faster than any peacetime transportation system could tolerate. The petroleum logistics alone required a supply chain of staggering complexity and scale. 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from Texas refineries to French ports in quantities exceeding 50,000 gallons monthly. transported across the Atlantic in tanker convoys that included 847 vessels making regular runs between American ports and Allied-controlled harbors, then distributed through a network of fuel depots, pipelines, and mobile dispensing units that delivered gasoline to frontline units with the reliability of civilian filling stations serving peacetime traffic on American highways. Each gallon of fuel reaching Patton's tanks had traveled over 4,000 miles from wellhead to battlefield, passing through refining facilities, storage tanks, ships, trucks, and temporary depots in a logistical chain that functioned despite U-boat attacks, air raids, and mechanical failures that would have paralyzed any transportation system designed according to European principles of efficiency and resource conservation. The tire replacement program illustrated the systematic approach to logistics that characterized American military planning, anticipating that each truck would require complete tire replacement every 15,000 miles. Red Ball Express planners stockpiled 500,000 replacement tires at depot facilities throughout liberated France, while mobile tire-changing units equipped with hydraulic jacks and pneumatic tools could replace all 6 tires on a 2.5-ton truck in under 30 minutes. Treating mechanical maintenance as a standardized industrial process, rather than the complex technical challenge that tire replacement represented for German forces operating with limited spare parts and improvised repair facilities. The pneumatic tools themselves required compressed air systems powered by portable generators that consumed additional gasoline, creating cascading supply requirements that multiplied geometrically while remaining manageable through the simple expedient of manufacturing enough equipment to make efficiency calculations irrelevant. Communication networks supporting Red Ball operations utilized 2,500 miles of telephone wire connecting dispatch centers, maintenance depots, and loading facilities through a system borrowed wholesale from civilian telephone companies, while radio communications employed 1,200 sets operating on frequencies coordinated through procedures developed by commercial broadcasting networks that had learned to manage continental communication systems during 2 decades of rapid expansion in American radio broadcasting. The communications infrastructure consumed 50 tons of copper wire monthly, required 200 trained technicians working continuously to maintain connections, and operated backup systems that could restore communications within 2 hours of any breakdown, creating redundancy levels that European military forces would have considered wasteful, but that American planners treated as standard operating procedure based on civilian experience with transcontinental telephone networks. Medical logistics supporting the Red Ball Express required 47 field hospitals, 235 ambulances, 1,200 medics, and pharmaceutical supplies that included 2,000 doses of penicillin, 500,000 blood plasma units, and surgical equipment sufficient to perform 15,000 operations monthly, all coordinated through evacuation procedures that could transport critically wounded soldiers from French battlefields to American hospitals within 72 hours using air transport networks that treated transcontinental medical evacuation as a routine logistical challenge rather than an extraordinary emergency measure requiring special authorization and resource allocation. It was the mathematics of American abundance applied to military problems with a scale and systematic thoroughness that transformed logistics from careful resource management into industrial demonstration, where success measured itself not in efficiency ratios or cost-benefit calculations, but in the simple capacity to maintain overwhelming supply superiority regardless of distance, enemy action, or theoretical limitations imposed by classical military doctrine. The moment of German comprehension arrived not through intelligence reports or battlefield analysis, but through the direct observation of American logistical excess that violated every assumption about resource management and military efficiency that had governed European warfare since the campaigns of Frederick the Great. Crystallizing on the afternoon of September 2, 1944, when Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich of the Wehrmacht's 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division found himself hiding in a roadside culvert near Chateau Thierry, watching an endless procession of Red Ball Express trucks that consumed gasoline with such casual abundance that American drivers were using precious fuel to power portable radios, electric razors, and coffee percolators as if petroleum were as unlimited as the air they breathed. Dietrich, a veteran logistics officer who had spent 3 years calculating fuel rations down to individual liters and rationing ammunition by the single round, witnessed American soldiers discarding half-empty gasoline cans because carrying partially filled containers violated standardized loading procedures that prioritize systematic efficiency over resource conservation. The German officer's worldview began its final collapse as he observed American mechanics changing truck tires that showed minimal wear, discarding rubber that German forces would have patched and repatched until it disintegrated completely, then watching those same mechanics pour unused motor oil into roadside ditches, rather than storing partially used lubricants that didn't meet precise viscosity specifications required by maintenance manuals that treated mechanical perfection as more important than resource scarcity. Through his binoculars, Dietrich could see Red Ball Express maintenance crews replacing entire truck engines after relatively minor mechanical problems, installing fresh Detroit-manufactured power plants with the casual efficiency of assembly line workers while discarding repairable engines that German mechanics would have spent weeks rebuilding from salvaged parts and improvised materials. The psychological impact of witnessing such systematic waste reached beyond individual shock to represent a fundamental challenge to the German understanding of industrial warfare, revealing that American logistics operated according to principles that treated abundance as a strategic weapon rather than scarcity as an inevitable constraint, requiring careful management and tactical accommodation. Dietrich watched American soldiers heating their field rations with gasoline-powered stoves that consumed more fuel in a single meal than German units received for weekly operations, while portable generators provided electric power for field telephones, lighting systems, and communication equipment that transformed American encampments into temporary industrial installations, rather than the Spartan military positions that characterized German operations after 4 years of increasingly desperate resource conservation. The breaking point came when Dietrich observed American forces establishing a temporary supply depot that functioned more like a civilian truck stop than a military facility, complete with the fueling stations that operated continuously, maintenance bays equipped with hydraulic lifts and pneumatic tools, and recreational facilities where off-duty drivers played baseball games using equipment that had been transported across the Atlantic Ocean alongside ammunition and medical supplies, as if American industrial capacity was so vast that shipping sporting goods to combat zones represented a negligible additional burden rather than an impossible luxury that no rational military force should contemplate during active operations against a determined enemy. The final assault on German assumptions occurred when American forces began using trucks to transport ice cream manufacturing equipment to frontline positions, establishing mobile ice cream production facilities that provided frozen desserts to combat troops with the same systematic efficiency that characterized ammunition distribution, revealing that American logistics had transcended military necessity to become a demonstration of industrial capacity so overwhelming that traditional concepts of wartime scarcity had become irrelevant considerations subordinate to maintaining civilian comfort levels even under combat conditions. Dietrich, trained to calculate resource allocation according to immediate tactical requirements, found himself confronting an enemy that transported luxury goods across oceanic distances and continental supply lines as casually as German forces moved essential ammunition, representing a transformation of warfare from struggle for survival into industrial demonstration. The German officers dispatched to Wehrmacht headquarters, written in pencil on salvaged paper and smuggled through German communication networks that were rapidly disintegrating under Allied pressure, captured the existential crisis facing professional soldiers whose entire military education had assumed that all armies operated under similar resource constraints. Enemy forces display logistical excess that transcends military requirements to become political demonstration of industrial capacity, maintaining supply operations that consume resources for psychological effect rather than tactical necessity, suggesting that American strategy aims not merely at military victory, but at demonstrating systemic superiority through waste that defeats enemy morale more effectively than battlefield success. The collapse of German defensive psychology revealed itself through about similar observations reported by surviving officers throughout the Western Front, as Wehrmacht units found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed immune to the logistical constraints that governed all previous military experience, creating a demoralization that extended beyond tactical defeats to challenge fundamental beliefs about the nature of warfare itself. Obergefreiter Wolfgang Brenner of the 2nd Panzer Division, writing in his diary during the retreat toward the Rhine, captured the psychological impact of American abundance. We fight an enemy that wastes more fuel in daily operations than we receive for monthly combat, whose soldiers complain about coffee quality while our men search for tree bark to supplement starvation rations, whose trucks break down and are immediately replaced rather than repaired because manufacturing new vehicles apparently requires less effort than maintaining existing equipment. The strategic implications extended beyond individual psychological impact to represent a systematic undermining of German military culture, which had evolved during centuries of continental warfare where resource scarcity required tactical sophistication, strategic brilliance, and individual excellence to overcome material disadvantages through superior planning, training, and leadership. American abundance transformed these traditional military virtues into irrelevant considerations, replacing tactical skill with logistical excess, strategic planning with industrial production, and individual heroism with systematic efficiency that reduced warfare to a competition between manufacturing capacities rather than military competencies, leaving German forces psychologically unprepared for combat against an enemy that had solved military problems through industrial methods rather than military solutions. The sight of American soldiers using gasoline to clean equipment, discarding clothing after minimal wear, and consuming food in quantities that exceeded German officers' peacetime standards represented more than logistical superiority. It constituted a systematic demonstration that warfare itself had been transformed from a contest between armies into a competition between entire societies, where victory would be determined by industrial capacity rather than military excellence, leaving traditional military virtues as obsolete as cavalry charges against machine gun positions. The transformation of warfare from military art to industrial demonstration reached its inevitable conclusion during the final weeks of September 1944 as German forces retreating toward the Rhine discovered that their opponents had fundamentally altered the relationship between resources and victory, replacing the careful calculations of classical military science with the brute application of manufacturing capacity that rendered traditional concepts of strategy, tactics, and operational planning subordinate to the simple question of which society could produce more trucks, gasoline, Waffen, and ammunition than the enemy could destroy through conventional military action. The Red Ball Express had become more than a supply system. It represented the emergence of industrial warfare as the dominant form of military competition, where success would be measured not in tactical brilliance or strategic genius, but in the capacity to maintain overwhelming logistical superiority across continental distances, while sustaining offensive operations indefinitely through systematic replacement of consumed resources. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commander of the German 7th Army during its disintegration in the face of American logistical abundance, captured the strategic implications in his final situation report transmitted to Wehrmacht High Command on September 15, 1944. Enemy forces have achieved decisive advantage not through superior tactics or strategic planning, but through logistical operations that function independent of traditional military constraints. Maintaining supply lines that consume more resources daily than entire German army groups receive monthly. Creating conditions where tactical excellence becomes irrelevant against opponents who can afford unlimited ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and equipment replacement. Eberbach's assessment reflected the professional soldier's recognition that warfare itself had evolved beyond the parameters established by European military tradition, entering a new phase where industrial capacity would determine outcomes more decisively than battlefield competence. The systematic nature of American industrial dominance revealed itself through comparative statistics that documented not merely quantitative superiority, but qualitative transformation of military logistics from careful resource management to industrial demonstration. German forces retreating from France reported capturing American supply depots containing more gasoline than entire Wehrmacht divisions received during monthly allocations, discovering ammunition stockpiles that exceeded German Army Group reserves, and encountering equipment graveyards where functional vehicles had been abandoned because transportation costs exceeded replacement expenses. According to American logistics calculations that treated mechanical assets as expendable commodities rather than irreplaceable military resources requiring careful maintenance and tactical protection, the philosophical implications of this transformation extended beyond immediate military consequences to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of power, conflict, and national strength that had governed European political thinking since the emergence of the modern state system during the 17th century. American victory in the logistics war represented not merely superior organization or tactical innovation, but the application of civilian industrial methods to military problems with a thoroughness that revealed warfare as ultimately subordinate to manufacturing capacity, economic organization, and systematic resource allocation rather than the martial virtues of courage, leadership, and tactical sophistication that had dominated military thinking throughout recorded history. The Red Ball Express embodied this transformation through its systematic disregard for military tradition in favor of civilian efficiency. operating according to principles learned in Detroit automobile factories, Chicago stockyards, and transcontinental railroad networks, rather than the staff colleges and military academies that had produced European officer corps trained in the classical arts of war but unprepared for competition against opponents who solved military problems through industrial methods rather than military solutions. American truck drivers, recruited from civilian transportation companies and trained in standardized procedures that emphasized mechanical reliability over tactical sophistication, had proven more decisive than German tank commanders educated in prestigious military institutions and experienced in years of combat operations across multiple theaters of war. The strategic lesson transcended immediate tactical applications to establish industrial capacity as the foundation of military power in the modern world, where victory would be determined by the ability to manufacture, transport, and maintain equipment faster than enemies could destroy it, creating conditions where traditional military skills became secondary considerations, subordinate to systematic resource management and logistical coordination. The mathematics of abundance had overwhelmed the logic of scarcity. American production lines had defeated German tactical excellence, and civilian transportation networks had proven superior to military supply systems designed according to centuries of European warfare experience and refined through decades of continental conflict. The German High Command's final assessment of American logistics capabilities, contained in a classified intelligence summary dated October 3, 1944, acknowledged the fundamental transformation that the Red Ball Express represented. Enemy supply operations function according to industrial rather than military principles, treating logistics as manufacturing problem requiring systematic application of civilian transportation methods rather than tactical challenge demanding military expertise, creating supply systems that maintain offensive capability independent of distance, terrain, or weather conditions through systematic redundancy and resource abundance that renders traditional logistics calculations obsolete. This admission represented more than tactical defeat. It constituted recognition that warfare itself had evolved beyond the parameters of European military tradition into industrial competition where victory belonged to societies capable of sustaining manufacturing superiority rather than armies distinguished by tactical excellence. The Red Ball Express had demonstrated that modern warfare was ultimately about production rather than destruction, logistics rather than tactics, and systematic organization rather than individual heroism, transforming military competition from a contest between armies into a demonstration of industrial supremacy, where the outcome would be determined not by battlefield brilliance but by the capacity to manufacture victory through overwhelming resource allocation sustained across oceanic distances and continental supply lines. The age of military art was yielding to the era of industrial warfare, where success required not generals trained in classical strategy, but engineers capable of organizing production systems, transportation networks, and supply chains that could outproduce enemy forces regardless of tactical competence or strategic sophistication. Not tactics, but the industrial inevitability of American manufacturing capacity projected across the Atlantic Ocean and deployed on European battlefields with systematic thoroughness that reduced warfare to logistics competition, where victory belonged to societies capable of producing more trucks than enemies could destroy, more gasoline than they could intercept, and more ammunition than they could expend, creating conditions where military excellence became subordinate to manufacturing supremacy in determining the outcome of continental warfare. The amber glow of that same desk lamp in the Château de la Roche-Guyon cast its familiar shadows across the oak-paneled war room on October 14, 1944, nearly 2 months after General Feldmarschall von Kluge had dismissed American logistics as amateur fumbling. But now the chateau stood empty except for a single American intelligence officer conducting post-battle assessment of German planning documents scattered across the mahogany table like archaeological artifacts from a vanished civilization. Major Robert Harrison of the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service picked up the reconnaissance photographs that von Kluge had studied with such confidence. Their black and white images of Red Ball Express convoys now transformed from evidence of American incompetence into documentation of the logistical revolution that had swept Wehrmacht forces from France faster than any military campaign in recorded history, reducing 4 years of German defensive preparation to historical footnotes subordinate to the mathematics of industrial abundance. The irony revealed itself through German situation reports filed during the final days of resistance, where Wehrmacht officers trained in classical military doctrine found themselves documenting their own obsolescence as representatives of military tradition, confronting opponents who had solved warfare through civilian methods borrowed from commercial transportation networks, manufacturing systems, and business organizations that treated continental distances as routine logistical challenges rather than insurmountable strategic obstacles requiring tactical genius to overcome. Colonel Heinrich Zimmermann's final intelligence summary, discovered among classified documents abandoned during the German retreat, captured the intellectual transformation imposed by American logistics. Enemy forces have demonstrated that modern warfare belongs not to armies but to societies, not to tactical excellence but to industrial supremacy, not to military genius but to systematic organization of manufacturing resources applied with civilian efficiency to military problems previously considered solvable only through professional military expertise. The strategic lesson had been written in truck tire tracks across the highways of liberated France, where Red Ball Express convoys continued their mechanical processions even after German resistance collapsed, their drivers maintaining delivery schedules with the methodical precision of men following civilian transportation procedures rather than responding to military emergencies, creating supply flows that exceeded immediate combat requirements because American industrial planning treated abundance as the foundation of strategic security rather than scarcity as an inevitable constraint requiring tactical accommodation. The trucks themselves, olive drab monuments to American manufacturing capacity, would continue rolling eastward across Germany throughout the remaining months of the war, carrying not only military supplies but ice cream, recreational equipment, and luxury goods that demonstrated the transformation of warfare from survival struggle to industrial demonstration. Major Harrison, examining captured German logistics manuals that calculated fuel consumption down to individual liters while American forces measured gasoline supplies in millions of gallons, discovered the mathematical foundation of German defeat written in the careful calculations that had assumed all armies operated under similar resource constraints, revealing military planning documents that treated scarcity as the fundamental condition of warfare while American industrial capacity had rendered such assumptions obsolete through the simple expedient of manufacturing enough trucks to make distance irrelevant, enough gasoline to make fuel conservation unnecessary, and enough ammunition to make rationing an anachronistic concept inherited from pre-industrial warfare. The human dimension of this transformation appeared in letters discovered among German personnel files, where Wehrmacht soldiers described encounters with American forces whose casual consumption of resources represented more than material superiority. It constituted psychological warfare against opponents trained to regard conservation as military virtue and waste as evidence of strategic incompetence. Gefreiter Hans Müller of the 352nd Infantry Division wrote to his family on September 8, 1944, "The Americans fight not like soldiers but like rich men spending inherited wealth, consuming ammunition as if factories produced shells faster than artillery could fire them, discarding equipment after minimal use as if replacement costs less than maintenance, demonstrating abundance that destroys our morale more effectively than their tactical competence destroys our defensive positions." The technological implications extended beyond immediate logistics to establish industrial manufacturing as the decisive factor in modern warfare, where victory would belong to societies capable of sustaining production superiority rather than armies distinguished by tactical excellence. Strategic planning, or operational competence according to classical military doctrine inherited from centuries of European warfare between opponents operating under similar resource constraints and technological limitations. The Red Ball Express had proven that American industrial capacity could overcome German tactical superiority through the systematic application of overwhelming resources organized according to civilian efficiency principles rather than military tradition, creating supply systems that functioned independent of battlefield conditions or enemy action. The transformation of warfare from military art to industrial competition revealed itself through comparative production statistics that documented not merely quantitative differences but qualitative changes in the nature of military power. American factories produced trucks faster than German forces could destroy them, manufactured ammunition in quantities that exceeded enemy consumption capabilities, and sustained supply operations across oceanic distances while maintaining offensive tempo that prevented enemy forces from establishing coherent defensive positions or organizing effective counterattacks against opponents who possessed unlimited replacement capacity for consumed resources. Staff Sergeant William Johnson, completing his final Red Ball Express run through the streets of recently liberated Paris on November 3, 1944, represented the human embodiment of this industrial revolution in military affairs. A Kansas truck driver whose casual competence in moving freight across continental distances had proven more strategically decisive than German general staff training, Prussian military tradition, or years of combat experience accumulated during 4 years of European warfare. His truck, designated Red Ball 1247 in white stenciled numerals, had traveled over 50,000 miles across the highways of liberated France, consuming gasoline, tires, and spare parts with systematic efficiency while delivering supplies that sustained American offensive operations independent of traditional logistics limitations or classical military constraints. The acrid smell of Turkish tobacco from German cigarettes lingered in the abandoned chateau war room, a ghostly reminder of confidence that had been systematically demolished not through superior strategy or tactical innovation, but through the industrial inevitability of American abundance applied to military problems with systematic thoroughness that reduced warfare to manufacturing competition where victory belonged to societies capable of outproducing rather than outfighting their opponents. The amber glow of the desk lamp illuminated empty chairs where German officers had calculated American defeat through mathematical certainty, their careful logistics equations rendered obsolete by opponents who had solved warfare through industrial excess rather than military excellence, transforming continental conflict from tactical competition into demonstration of manufacturing supremacy that would determine the outcome of global warfare for generations to come.